Now that we've started up and launched our config server, here's what we need to do next. All our other microservices need to be able to get their configuration information from the config server. In other words, we need to make sure the other microservices are running with the config server, friends. So let's do that. How are we going to make this happen, guys? Now, for this, you need to make sure that your microservices get their application.yml files from the config server. How are we going to do that? First, you need to specify that the microservices will use the config server as a config client. In other words, you need to add the dependencies. Here, you add them individually. So, how do we add them? Look, in the dependencies, I had added the Spring Cloud config client in Gradle when adding the others. So, you come here. Implementation libs. You add the Spring Cloud config client. Now, after you add this, it gets activated. Once this is activated as a configuration, it starts going to the config server. Guys, alright, now this. So, for the auto microservice to be able to connect to the config server, it needs some parameters from you. What does it need? Where am I going to connect? What is the address of the config server? You need to provide information like which YAML file to fetch. Now, let's do that. Now, you say Spring Cloud config URL. Now, the information you need to provide here. http://localhost:8888. This is the URL you'll connect to. So, you also need to tell it how to import the configs that Spring will import. So, you say it like this. Config import. Normally, how do you do it manually? But if you're going to do it with the config server, you put it in quotes like this. You're saying, I will import my configurations using the config server. So, what is the application name? When it asks that, this time you say, what was the name of our thing? In Spring Cloud, it's out-application, meaning out-. So, this out microservice will import its configuration from the config server. The address of the config server is this, and when it goes there, it will fetch the YAML file named out-application and load it here, import it. That's what you're saying. Now look, when I run the application, how will it work? It will connect to the config server and operate using the information it gets from the config server. Please pay attention. On which port did it start up? On 9099. Why? Because that's how we set it up here. Did you see that? So it pulled its information from there. Now, we need to do the same configurations for the user this time. First, let's get the implementation and add the user as well. Then, let's take the application.yml as it is. Let's edit the application of the user microservice. Let's just paste it here. Here, instead of out, we call this the user application. And we're starting up our user as well. Let's run it. As we can see, now both of our microservices have started up through the config server and are working properly, friends. That's how simple the integrations are. You can easily switch the whole ecosystem to this, friends. And finally, I want to say this. In these setups, friends, I mean in setups where you need to write an IP address, it's much better and more proper to do it like this. For the out microservice and the user microservice, it's much better to move the URLs you've written here into environment variables and use them from there. So, if you provide and use this information through environment variables, it will make much more sense. Just like how I moved the GIT address and its password to the config server.